Hi, it's Matt McLachlan with a very special invitation to join me in Gallipoli. For the first time, my signature tour is going to Gallipoli, and in May 2025, we're going to spend 10 days walking in the footsteps of the Anzacs on the most iconic battlefields of this most iconic campaign. And joining me on this epic adventure is the one and only Peter Hart. You've read the books, you've listened to the podcasts, now walk the ground with Peter and me. Now, this is a one-off tour. It's the only tour I'll be personally escorting in 2025, and having Peter Hart with me just makes it all the more special. I have no idea if we will ever run this tour again, so don't miss the chance to join us in Istanbul on the 21st of May, 2025. Visit battlefields.com.au for full details, and I look forward to seeing you in Gallipoli.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and thank you for joining us for another episode of Living History. This is a really exciting one. I'm very happy to be bringing this to you. For the past 6 months or so, I've been living in the UK. I'm back in Australia now, but I had an amazing experience living and working in the UK, visiting historic sites all over Western Europe, meeting some incredible historians, speaking at festivals and doing a whole range of wonderful things. And as part of that, I launched with my good friend Peter Hart, a brilliant historian, an idea that we called History in 6 Objects, where we would go to a museum, we would find 6 objects that tell a tale, and use that to tell a really engaging history story. And that's what we're bringing you this week. We went to the National Army Museum in Chelsea in London, and if you haven't been there, I really suggest you do. It's a fantastic museum of British military history. And while we were there, we told the story of the Battle of Waterloo, an incredible battle that most people find compelling and engaging. And I tell you what, our visit to the museum really reinforced that. It's an incredible battle, and this was a great way to tell the story. So what you're going to hear this week is Peter and I walking around the museum discussing specific objects that tell the story of the Battle of Waterloo. If you enjoy this, there is a video version on YouTube as well. So if you go to the Matt McLachlan History YouTube page, you'll find Peter Hart and I walking around telling the story of Waterloo. Relics. Now, before we jump in, I just wanted to say a thank you to our subscribers, as always. We love having subscribers who get bonus content and a lot of other exclusive things that they can only get through subscribing. And there is a bonus episode this week just for subscribers, which is an interview with Peter and I talking about walking the battlefield of Waterloo and what you can see and the top sites to see if you're visiting the battlefields today. So check that out. To subscribe, just click on the link in the show notes and that'll take you to our Patreon page where you can get that exclusive content. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening as always. And here is Peter Hart and I exploring the National Army Museum. I'm Matt McLachlan.
I'm Peter Hart.
We're here at the National Army Museum in Chelsea in London, and it's time for another History in 6 Objects. Pete, what are we doing today?
We're doing the Battle of Waterloo.
Let's get to it. Pete, our first object is this really quite wonderful painting by Lady Butler, known as a few different things, the Dawn of Waterloo.
Valley, that kind of thing, yeah.
I mean, have a look at it though. This shows British troops before the battle. It's not something we often talk about as what was happening before the battle, but obviously essential to the story of how the troops actually got there. What does this say to you, Pete?
Well, firstly, I like the focus on the ordinary soldier. I mean, there are officers in it, but there is a heavy focus on soldiers waking up. Imagine what it was like. You know, it had been chucking it down. There's the echoes of the storm up there. It's been chucking it down, and they're wet, they're probably cold, and there they are. And there's just some lovely, lovely detail work on it, and the atmosphere is great. You not think it's just it's almost, you're not there, but you get a feeling of what it must have been like. And
cold and wet, I think. Look at the embers of the fire. This guy's under his coat. There's just so many things, and of course we've got the officers riding along, blowing reveille to say, "Get up, night's over, time to get on with your job." And little did they know what was coming up for them later today.
And I think she's got the idea of dawn and the passing storm. I just think it's very emotive. It's a cracky bit of work.
It's an unusual military depiction as well, isn't it? Because often, especially from this time, this was the era of Napoleon on his grand steed and huge battles and charging cavalry. This is a real insight into, as you say, just the common man and what he was experiencing in the lead up to the battle.
And you can see the nerves. They're not laughing, are they? I mean, several of them are clearly thinking about what lies ahead of them. And what lies ahead of them is one of the most murderous battles of that time.
Did the common soldier know at this stage that today he would be facing Napoleon on the battlefield at Waterloo?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it's obvious Wellington's taken up the position. Part of it depends on what the Prussians do. Because if the Prussians had gone the other way and retreated, not come towards, then he would have had to retreat. So I presume a lot of them were aware that this might be the day, and that it might be the day they die or get maimed or whatever.
Pete, it's an incredible depiction of this unit before the battle, but I understand when it was created, this painting, there was a couple of crafty little things that the artist did to help her imagine the scene.
Well, yeah, that in itself is a story, Matt. Because what she did was she's not an expert on Napoleonic stuff. It was in 1895, 80 years later. So what she did was she went around junk shops and things and bought items of uniform and things to get the pick. And then, by repute, and I have to say this is just something that's been told to me, she actually got a regiment to trample over a field to sort of get the idea of how it would have looked. I think that's fantastic. And I understand this has been especially conserved and renovated by the National Army Museum. And they've made a great job of it, I think. It's very powerful. And it's a big part of the story for me.
I just want to think of a time when you could walk into a junk shop and buy relics from Napoleonic battles. We were born too late, mate. We were born too late. But just a fantastic painting. I love it.
The other point about this picture that just comes to me, funnily enough now, is that this could have just as well have been an after the battle scene. I mean, he could be dead, not asleep. And I think that must be deliberate, that she's gone for an echo of what the future would be for some of these men.
I thought it was when we approached this. I thought he was receiving medical treatment. I thought this guy was dead. You're right. That's absolutely deliberate. She's seen works of art that depict the horror and the aftermath of the battle, and she's wanted to marry that together with these men in the days before the battle.
It's a brilliant piece of work.
I love it. The item we're going to look at, Pete, now is it's not a single item, but we're going to look at some items that tell the essential part of a story of a battle, the weapons that they used. Obviously, we're talking about fighting, we're talking about an army's ability to take on another army, and that's done with weaponry. And this is the place to start. Artillery, cannons. I mean, again, probably not what people first think of when they think of the Battle of Waterloo. They probably think of charging cavalry and infantry and the whole thing, but artillery was essential to the battle, wasn't it?
Probably the biggest killer on the battlefield. When you think of how many guns there were, and they fire 42,000 cannonballs. That level of death and destruction dealt out by this sort of cannon. They're just smooth bore. They're very simple weapons. They're loaded at the barrel. There's nothing sophisticated about it at all.
Tell me what they were shooting, because every time we see a depiction of any battle at any stage in history, what we see is infantry marching and huge explosions as artillery flies in. Was it like that at the Battle of Waterloo?
No, an awful lot of it would be cannonballs. So about that big, depending on what size the cannon is, but about that big. And they're just loaded in and fired. And then a deadly weapon that I almost can't imagine how deadly it was is canister, which is sort of like a thin tin case full of of musket balls, essentially.
So it's like a giant shotgun.
That giant shotgun, and they could double load them as well. God, and if you were within 300 yards or 400 yards, it would just rip you apart, rip a formation of infantry apart. They also had shells which were again spherical and would explode with a fuse, but they weren't full of shrapnel so much often as they were fired by howitzers. Different. But we had shrapnel. We had shrapnel shells as well, so we were that was one thing the British were ahead on.
So let's talk about this idea of shrapnel without getting too technical about it. But the word shrapnel has now come to apply to any fragment of an exploding shell, but in this era, it was a very specific weapon.
Invented by Major Shrapnel, I think.
What was it?
And basically, it's just musket balls, again, lead balls inside a thing, and when it explodes, it pushes them out.
And it exploded in the air, didn't it?
In the air, yeah, they're a timed fuse. And they could be fired by these, and the French didn't have them. We're not experts on this, but when you see these actual weapons, you think, that's not complicated, is it? And this is, it's in front of a picture of the olden days, even for then. But the point is, they were in use a long time, and that applies to a lot of the weapons of the Battle of Waterloo. This is not fought with newfangled weapons. There are a few, but mostly it's fought with things that have been in use for the best part of 100 years. It's a sort of culmination of death and mayhem on the battlefield. And in the 19th century, it starts to move on.
And Pete, you've got a quote here from someone who was at the Battle of Waterloo that describes in pretty graphic detail the horrors of coming under artillery fire.
Oh, absolutely. It's from an Ensign Keppel of the 14th Foot. And this is horrible. He says this: a round shot took off his head. It was a bugler and splattered the whole battalion with his brains. The colours and the ensigns in charge of them coming in for an extra share. One of them, Charles Fraser, a fine gentleman in speech and manner, raised a laugh by drawling out, "How extremely disgusting." A second shot carried off 6 of the men's bayonets. A third broke the breastbone of a lance sergeant, whose piteous cries were anything but encouraging to his youthful comrades. And that's, pretty horrible. If you want another one. We had 3 companies almost shot to pieces. One shot killed and wounded 25 of the 4th Company. Another of the same kind killed poor Fisher, my captain, and 18 of our company. Another killed or wounded 23. At the same time, poor Fisher was hit. I was speaking to him, and I got all his brains. His head was blown to atoms, and that was Lieutenant Hugh Ray of the 40th Foot. Wow.
Pete, what I'm hearing here, which is consistent with everything we do. We've talked about Gallipoli, we talk about Waterloo today, we talk about the Second World War. There's a consistency that comes through this, which is the absolute horror of being under artillery fire, isn't it? It's just one aspect of the battlefield that is repeated time and time again. You come under artillery fire and it's absolutely horrific. Did you find that in your experience of speaking to veterans, that the concept of artillery fire was a major component of their battlefield?
That is the biggest thing, whether you be talking about, even on the first day of the Somme, artillery is the main killer. That's it. And throughout all the campaigns I've ever interviewed about, artillery has been the biggest killer and the one that most emotionally scars the men. Because somebody can adjust something in the Second World War or later, adjust a mechanism, and that's you gone. And it's a terrible business.
What does that do to a man when he's on the battlefield? This distant killer, men that are hundreds of yards away, possibly kilometres or miles away, zeroing in on his position, and he can't do a single thing about it. What does that do to a man on the battlefield?
Well, it unmans them a little. It's not good for the morale. And then you get back to Waterloo, where you can see the guns and you know what they're doing. And when you have to form square, because cavalry are about, well, you're in a square. 4 deep square or 3 deep square, and you are the easiest target one can imagine for the guns, and they're splattering you, and you're being splattered, as in those quotes, with brains and everything, because you're just an easy target.
It's just horrific, and it's why it's so important to stand here and actually see this weapon and know what that represents. It's crucial.
It's almost harmless looking.
It is impotent. It looks impotent, but it was anything but. Pete, we've just talked about artillery, and moving on to other weapons on the battlefield. I mean, this is the essential one. We're talking about the muskets, the rifles that the men carried. Good example here. What are we looking at?
Well, this is it's called a new land pattern musket and bayonet. There it is. But it's known. There are many patterns of it. It comes in about 1720. It's still in use in about 1840. It's essentially an all bog standard musket, which means it's smooth bore. It's a flintlock. It's amazing. It is known as the Brown Bess. Now, why is it called the Brown Bess?
Why is it called the Brown Bess?
Who knows? It could be because the metal was dyed brown. It could be because of it's a euphemism for a woman of the night, said he carefully. It could be a lot of things, and I don't know why it is. What I do know is that this is what a lot of the ordinary British regiments were armed with. And what I like about this is that it sums up the whole point of training, because the only way to use this weapon is to fire it in volleys, massed volleys. You couldn't hit a barn door with it at 100 yards. So you need to fire all together, and it's effective up to about 80 yards or 80 metres, but from about 50, up to 50, it's deadly. Can you keep your nerve and hold fire? What about letting the other side fire first? Well, that might kill a load of you. And you can imagine, so the officer has to control the timing of a volley. Then you've got you've got the sergeants, the NCOs, who've got to control what's going on amongst the men. They've got to make sure that they don't panic, try and stop that. And, of course, the men have to keep their nerve. Now, to load that, there are 11 separate movements. Don't ask me to name them. and if you lose your nerve or rush it or in any way screw it up, then you'll get a misfire. It just won't fire, or it'll go off at half cock, or you'll fire the ramrod. You'll fire that off. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and you have to be able to do that. The idea is to do it 3 times a minute. Possibly 4. 2's not good enough, and it's just you need to be trained. You can't just be a farmhand and be expected to do that. You couldn't do it. You and I couldn't load it once in an hour.
I remember accounts from the American Civil War talking about muzzle loaders and talking about that in the heat of the battle, the panic that came over men, that after big battles they would find several shots loaded in the barrel at once because they'd missed one of those important steps, gone to fire, and it hadn't fired, and in the heat of the battle they hadn't even reloaded the next shot, and of course they just clogged the whole thing up. So a fascinating depiction of the panic in that moment of trying to load when your life's at risk. But the other thing I notice is quite a lengthy bayonet on the end, and I've heard accounts of officers saying that no man was ever bayoneted who hadn't put his hands up first. Was that the account at Waterloo? Was that the case at Waterloo, or was the bayonet an important weapon?
The bayonet is an important weapon at Waterloo. Not so much in infantry v infantry. If you're a column's advancing on a line, they will break up before they get anywhere near the bayonet, usually. What that was useful for is when they're in their squares, because it's the bayonets that hold back the cavalry, the horses, basically. Yeah. And that's the main use of the bayonet. Altogether, it's a simple and primitive weapon system, but in the hands of people who keep their nerve, who know what they're doing, who fire low, don't aim high, because that's their recruits, they aim high. It is just... Well, to me, it tells a great part of the story of Waterloo. And you know, when you're looking at how the infantry behave in battle, it all comes down to often how many rounds can they fire in a minute.
The thing that's interesting about this, Pete, is that the technology wasn't static, you know, over this period of time. And if we just go up here, we've got something which demonstrates the evolution of technology that was occurring at about the time of the Battle of Waterloo. So here's, it looks ostensibly the same. But what are we looking at here?
Well, it's a bit shorter. It's a Baker rifle, and it's the next thing, because this has a rifling which spins a bullet. It's more accurate, so you can hit an individual person at a much longer range. So you're not dependent on volleys. On massed volleys, you can. And so this was the weapon that was given to a lot of the rifle rifle battalions.
That's why they're called rifle battalions, weren't they? Because they carried rifles as opposed to muskets.
Well, so it was.
A and B, it comes together.
It all comes, and this is the future. That the brown bess is the past, but it's still another 20 or 30, 25 years before the brown bess is not issued anymore. And this does take. It's slower to load. You can fire only two rounds a minute. It makes a difference.
Was Waterloo at a transition time in the way that the First World War saw a big evolution of technology, the Second World War saw a big evolution? Were the Napoleonic Wars an evolutionary time, or were they just relying on technology they had at hand?
I think, in essence, they rely on past technology. I'm not an expert on the period. I'm interested in the period. I find that most of the technology is the old Elizabeth, and the newer things like the Baker. They are coming in, but they aren't dominant. I mean, this is the weapon of a very small proportion of the Allied army. For the French skirmishers, they still had muskets. So this is a sign of the future. But most of it, the uniforms, everything, and of course there wasn't much fighting for 30 years after Waterloo. So that's the next big step. And even then, the Crimea, for instance, is not that far on. A lot of it is recognizable.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
We've talked about weapons, obviously instrumental to anything that goes on to a battlefield, but this is a human story. We're talking about people here, and it's easy to read a history book or talk about weapons and casualties on the battlefield, but we've got our next item just talks about that human cost of being wounded on the battlefield. We've got a bone saw and a bloody glove that was used in an amputation at Waterloo. I mean, what does this tell you, Pete?
Part of it. It's the bone saw was used by the surgeon who sawed off the leg of the Earl of Uxbridge. Now, he'd had a good battle up to then, you could say. He'd led that famous, he'd ordered the famous cavalry charge that wrecked one of the great attacks that Napoleon launched earlier, the first great attack on, and he'd had a good battle. But then he was hit, and his leg had to be amputated. Now, that is the actual bone saw that was used, and that is the glove of one of his aide-de-camps who held him down.
No anaesthetic, obviously.
No anaesthetic.
A shot of rum and a stick between the teeth, and away you go.
And I want you to picture how they did it. They basically, they put a tourniquet on about 3 inches above the site of where they're going to cut. Wow! And then they use a sharp knife to cut away down to the bone. They tie back the arteries, and then they get the bone saw out, that bone saw, and they saw through it quickly. tie the arteries up, and then wrap it in linen bandages.
But they had to, didn't they? Because this was an era where medicine was primitive. Yeah. And, we're talking about these weapons and slow-moving musket balls, cannonballs loping through the air. These are going to do horrendous injuries to men on the battlefield. And if you don't get that limb off, it's going to turn gangrenous and the man's going to die.
Yeah.
So this was as horrific as it is. This was the only way to save a life with this primitive medicine.
And I just you look at that bloody glove. And I'm not swearing there, Matt, but a bloody glove.
Yeah, it is a bloody glove as opposed to a bloody glove. Yeah. The thing I note here, Pete, not to be flippant, but look how intricate the handle is on that bone saw. I mean, the work that this is designed to do, but it's got quite a flowery, decorative handle on it.
It has to be quick. Yeah. Because you just die of shock as well as anything else you can die of.
Well, the surgeons prided themselves on how quickly they could get a leg off, didn't they? Because it was you'd see outside the rudimentary hospitals piles of discarded limbs as they did their horrific work. But it's important to remember this stuff. We shouldn't come to a magnificent museum like this one and just look at guns and flags and the triumph of war. We should talk about what this means on a human level. And I think so many years after the event, that's what we always have to drag it back to. These were people. These were like you and me. These were like anyone who's watching this now. These were human beings who went through a very human experience, a horrific experience in many cases, and there's nothing that sums it up more than this display.
No, nothing.
We shouldn't forget, Pete, that the Battle of Waterloo spelt pretty significant defeat for Napoleon and the French, the end of his time as an emperor. This item, our next item, sums that up very well. This is it's a standard. It's a flag that was carried into battle. It's written in French, so I assume it was carried by the French. But this is the sort of thing that was not supposed to be captured, was it? It was representative of the regiment. It was their pride. They marched under the colours, and the fact that it's now here in a museum in London indicates how wrong things went for the French.
That's right, and there's the eagle. That's the real sort of that. The eagle is what sort of. It's like our regimental standard that we used to carry into battle. The eagle, and that's to capture the eagle. And this eagle and this banner are, as you could see, from the 105th Regiment. They were in the attack on the left, the British left, at the start, about 1 o'clock. It was captured by, who's captured it? Captain Clark. I think he had help. Yeah, I think he had help. And but in itself, it's a story because that he chose the eagle rather than the lion or the cock. So he chose the eagle. And he issued them in about 1804, 1805 when he became emperor. And then when the king came back after Napoleon was exiled, they scrapped them all. Napoleon comes back 1815. They make a whole load more, and Napoleon issued them to his regiments before, so like 100 he issued before Waterloo. And this in fiction, if you have a fictional story, you always have the hero will capture the eagle, and who do you think it will? It goes back to something else, which is the Roman eagle as well, in my view, and that's the imperial Roman eagle, and that's what Napoleon's doing, I think. So, and there it is. That is the actual banner carried into action by 105th Regiment. There's their eagle, and it's a fantastic story. And guess why there aren't any more? There aren't any in French museums. Because when the royalty came back, Louis the 16th or whatever he was, 17th, 18th, stupid system. When he came back, 18th, they're all destroyed again. And so the ones we captured at Waterloo, or this one, here it is.
What did it mean to the men? What do you think that meant to the men when they had marched into battle under that banner? And plenty of them would have seen that banner fall. I mean, what effect did that have? Was that the end for them? Was that this is the end of our regiment?
No, they'd carry on. They were in retreat anyway. That's how they got it. And they were pushed. They certainly went back into action later on. But it meant an incredible amount to the officers and men of a regiment. It really did. And there's this great story, which I suspect is urban myth, if they had urban myths in the 19th century. But that when the king came back and all these were destroyed, that some of the regiments, the officers burnt the standards and then put the ashes into their wine, so that they always carried it with them.
I really hope that's true.
I hope it's true as well. But I think it's great.
This is a peculiar exhibit, Pete, but I think
it's fabulous, isn't it?
Well, actually, we've got a whole corner here dedicated to Napoleon. The object we're going to talk about is Napoleon's horse, well, the skeleton of Napoleon's horse. A bit of a murky story about whether this was his horse and how it came to be captured and the whole bit. So Marengo, his name.
Marengo, yeah.
The horse.
It was an Arab grey.
Oh, an Arab grey. What do we know about this horse?
Well, it's definitely a horse. It was just kept. It was captured at the battle. It was captured in 1815. I think there is a murkiness, and I think you spotted it there. I believe that its feet are not necessarily from the same, or hoofs, or whatever you call them things that go on the end of it. And to me, it's just... It is mostly Marengo, I think is clear, and therefore it may have been at the Battle of Waterloo, and it may not. But whatever, that used to have Napoleon on its back. Now, does that not set your juices going a bit?
And this little corner, I mean, we've got a lock of Napoleon's hair. We've got his ancient water type heat. I don't know what that's called, but it was to heat water. We should talk a little bit about Napoleon because an up and down career. This was the end of his career, obviously. What happened on this battlefield marked the end of his career.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who think he was a great man. I think he got an awful lot of people killed, and at times in his career he was erratic. And I think Waterloo is not his finest moments. But then he was faced with two brilliant Allied generals, Blucher and Wellington, and they performed brilliantly against him. And I think that's... in the end, Napoleon failed. And there are people who say he came from nowhere and he conquered everything. He didn't conquer anything in the end. He ended up in exile, dying in exile. But he was on that horse in front of us. I've got a simple mind. I keep going back to... I can just almost picture him.
Well, let's talk about horses, though, on the battlefield, because cavalry. We've got to talk about cavalry charges. We've all seen the incredible depictions of the charge. I mean, scary, incredible paintings, but terrifying in what they represent. Cavalry charging down lines of infantry. That was a key figure of the battle, wasn't it?
If you caught them in column or line, then you got... that's quite a small horse. But the British heavy cavalry, when they smash into d'Erlon's corps, when they attack on the right, each one of them is this bloody great big horse, and then on top of it, a big bloke with a huge great sword. And the kinetic force, if that's the right word, the kinetic force is incredible. And this is what they call l'arme blanche. It's terrifying. And the only real way to stop it is to be in square with those bayonets locked into the ground, and so that there's no flank to go round, so that they can't gallop round you and come at you from behind. And cavalry, they're a mixture of one of the most potent, deadly weapons on the battlefield, and completely useless against the British square, or actually Hanoverian square, or any of the other squares. But it's worth remembering that when you formed a square, what happened? You were vulnerable to artillery, and this is the question: when do you form square? Because if you form square and they don't attack with cavalry, they just pound you with the artillery. But if you go into column or line and the cavalry attack, then you're in a lot of trouble.
You're in the infantry in 1815, Pete. Would you prefer to face down a charge of heavy cavalry or an onslaught of the artillery?
I'd prefer to do neither. I'd rather be a so-called historian and pontificating from afar.
I'm being silly, but it raises an important point, doesn't it?
The
horrors of the battlefield.
If you're not in the square and the cavalry attack, you're probably going to be dead. It's a murderous and efficient weapon for destroying broken infantry. The artillery will kill a lot of you in a square, but they won't kill all of you. I think that's the sort of thing.
Well, that's why it's such an important part of the exhibition. Yeah. I mean, it's Napoleon's horse, but having a horse here when we're talking about Waterloo, absolutely essential.
We need to mention it.
Pete, if we want a bird's eye view of the Battle of Waterloo, there's really no better tool than this magnificent model. I mean, what are we looking at here?
Well, We're looking at here at Siborne, William Siborne's model of the Battle of Waterloo. And I'm filled with admiration for most of this. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. In a way, we both love personal histories. And this is the ultimate result of his investigations, his personal histories of the battle. He contacted every surviving British and possibly some of the German officers, not the Prussians or the French. It is biased. And he ignored the German officers, but he produced this. He uses 700 interviews. And if you think of that, when we write one of our books, we don't use 700 interviews. And he used it to create this magnificent model, which was about, 1838, I think it was finished. So it's within living memory of the battle. It is an amazing piece of work. It's got about 30,000 individual figures on. It covers the battle perfectly from the British perspective.
Well, talk to me about that. There's a political angle to this, isn't there?
Oh, no.
There's a rather large chunk of the story missing.
There is a huge chunk. The German nations fighting for the British are underrepresented. They're not properly in the story. It isn't an English or British army. It is an allied. The Dutch, the Hanoverians, all the other German small nations are involved. But most of all, who's missing? Who?
The Prussians. Where are the Prussians?
Well, there's Plansnoir way over there. Where are the Prussians? Well, it's just completely out of the story. It's as if it's a completely trivial, unimportant part of the battle. Yet, the British, Wellington, they're one part, the Allied army, they're one part of the story. The Prussians is an equally important part of the story.
That's a small part of it. Didn't the Prussians have 50,000 men here on the battlefield? That's a lot. That's nearly the same size as the entire French force.
Yeah, the Prussians, there are two heroes, Blucher and Wellington. You don't have to denigrate Wellington to appreciate Blucher's contribution. I don't like that. I mean, to me, they're both great generals. I think you'd probably want to go for a drink with Blucher rather than Wellington.
But that's the point. Wellington would have seen this model. Like, this is not something that was recently created. This was created for Wellington. Wellington would have stood, not in this museum, but Wellington would have stood overlooking this same model.
And it is.
And was that an element? Were they trying to appease Wellington?
I think so, definitely. Wellington was Prime Minister as well for periods of the intervening. And the thing is, this is meant to be viewed from here. This is meant to be viewed from this side, from the Allied ridge. Now, I think this model presents us with a chance to have a real look at the battle, to talk about what's going on. You can see some of the great elements, can't you? There, look, Hougoumont, there it is. And you see why it's important. Hougoumont, La Haye Saint, the ridge, you've got the Plansnoir, it's all there. And best is to go there.
Well,
do you not agree?
This is something I wanted to say as well. The first thing about this is it was, again, designed in a time before television where people couldn't get their head around what they were looking at. They'd maybe seen a few artworks and that sort of thing, but there's nothing like seeing this. We see the same thing, incidentally, in the Australian War Memorial with the beautiful dioramas to tell the story of the First World War.
They're fantastic.
There was this in the era before video technology. How do you bring the message of how huge a battlefield was and how many people were involved to people who hadn't been there? This is the thing. But as you say, we can still do that today. There's almost a way of time travelling that I know that you and I love, which is to get out yourself and walk the ground. And doesn't this... I have never been to the Waterloo battlefield.
Oh, you must go.
But doesn't this excite me about getting out there and seeing the ridges laid out, seeing the key villages, seeing where the armies were lined up? I mean, this is why we've got to get out. I mean, you've been there, Pete. What does it tell you about the battle when you walk the ground?
Well, for instance, Hougoumont, what a place to visit. And it's, the story of the gates, some of those stories are a little bit not exactly spot on.
Embroidered?
Embroidered, yeah. But there is embroidery going on, but there's the whole story as well. It's still it's a battle within a battle, and the story of how the French attacked and the Germans and the guards who held it it is a great story. And, you know, you can look at the garden, you can look at the field around you, can look, the wood's gone, but you can look at it, you can look at the north gate, you can look at the south gate, the rest of it. It's exciting, and that's just one of many things. But I love Planchenoit. I think I'm just perverse. So I love that the church at Planchenoit, the fighting was just as big. And, of course, that's something you can see on the ground. It's not on this model, because this model is made to underrepresent the Prussian achievement. But when you're on the ground, you can go to Planchenoit. You can look round it and see it. But what a place. And do you know, it's mostly unspoilt. There's a big motorway cutting through here, but other than that, off sort of this corner, but the rest of it is pretty well as it was.
The other thing that I think it's important to note when you look at models like this is we've been talking about weapons, we've been talking about rifles and muskets and things, but this demonstrates the importance of artillery, because throughout the model are little bumps in the ground and little high points, and on just about all of them is a battery of guns designed to fire down into what is lower ground below them.
Yeah. The Grand Battery of the French, a concentration of guns. Again, there's questions as to whether there really ever was a Grand Battery. Yeah. I don't really care, because when I was there, I just went and looked at one of the two possible sites and just thought, wow, this is great. It may have been here and it may have been there. I'm not bothered. I'm still getting the feel for it. The ridge has been spoilt a little because they built a gigantic mound for the William of Orange. So the ridge isn't quite as dominant as it was. On the other hand, you've got this sort of mound that you can go up. And I tell you, you need to be fit to get up those stairs. I'm not sure. You're getting old, Matt. Your legs might struggle a bit going up there.
Well, we've been up ridges at Gallipoli, you know.
Yeah. Oh, you might be all right.
I struggle, yeah. But that's the thing, high ground. We talk about high ground. We've done it at Gallipoli, we've done it on the Western Front, and we're going to sound like a broken record, the importance, particularly in these earlier battles, the importance of the high ground. And doesn't this illustrate it perfectly? Absolutely. If you were going to set up this battle, you'd say, well, that's where I want to be. A long ridge line looking down over my enemy, perfect place to be.
And Wellington apparently spotted it early. I mean, again, people argue about every single aspect of the Battle of Waterloo. It's part of its fun. But I believe that he spotted this early and always had it in mind as somewhere that he could use for one of his famous defensive battles. And what a battle it was. And it is actually very compact. The number of dead in such a small area. And afterwards, Waterloo teeth. You've heard about Waterloo teeth. Well, they used the teeth to make false teeth. So people talked about Waterloo teeth because they got teeth made. Because there were so many bodies, so many... It's details like that make you realise what a bloody, horrible, terrible battle it was.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.